And you can see the native Hawaiians. It's kind of outrageous to our 21st century sentiments, but it was all part and parcel of encouraging tourism. And it's unsettling to see this photograph now. Now, the physical landscape, which Queen Liliukalani was so attuned to, she was very, very aware and sensitive to the natural world and the way that the natural world was changing as so much of the landscape was being plowed under for sugarcane. And one of the, these are called o'o birds. They're very unusual birds. They kind of use their beaks to break into, to get nectar and stuff. But most importantly, they have little yellow tufts like that. And during Queen Liliukalani's lifetime, those birds, her sightings of them became more and more rare. They started to disappear. They've recently gone extinct. There are no more of these. And these are when you go to the DeYoung Museum, there was a recent exhibit like 2 years ago of amazing Hawaiian treasures, and they had these capes. And the capes, I don't know if anybody saw this, were made of the feathers of these extraordinary honey creeper birds. And can you just imagine what that world was like? And the ali'i, or the chief, would wrap themselves in these capes that had been created out of those feathers. So that world was very, very rapidly disappearing. Again, another example of the Royal Hawaiian Featherworks. So, tragedy struck the House of Kalakaua. King Kalakaua was visiting San Francisco in 1891, and he was staying at the Palace Hotel, which is in the same spot it is today, and he died very suddenly. And there was a huge funeral procession, front page news in San Francisco, and of course in Honolulu, and it was shocking. And as a result, his younger sister, Queen Liliukalani, who was a princess at the time, was thrust into the role of being the Queen of Hawaii. And this is a photograph of her, and she's in a carriage, and she is on her way to the legislature. And so much of the imagery is very much, again, like the British royal family. She was dressed in silks. She could have, she was a Victorian lady in many respects. She was very well traveled. She was very well educated. But she ruled for only 2 years, from 1891 to 1893. This photograph was taken in 1893, at a moment in January when the Queen decided that she would try to gain back some of the powers that had been handed over by her brother to the business class. And she's headed to the legislature to talk about this, and as a result, a coup begins, and she's overthrown. And it all happens within literally 24 hours of this photograph being taken. Yes?
Do we know the cause of death of her brother?
Oh, yes, thank you for asking that question. Her brother had a number of very serious health problems. He was a very, very heavy drinker, for one thing, but he also had, I believe, what's known as Bright's disease, and that's what researchers now think he died of. But it was shocking. It was a shocking tragedy for the family, and both the brother and the sister had experienced a huge number of deaths of family members and of Native Hawaiian relatives over the years. I mean, it was so improbable that she would ever become the Queen of Hawaii, and the reason she became that was so many people around her died, family members. So it was awful, yeah. So I mentioned the day, January 14th, 1893. This is, it's taking a step back, the lens is back. It's the same photograph, but it gives you a sense of her carriage ride to the legislative building. And this is the day that the Marines get off of a US warship, march down the streets of Honolulu, and in essentially a bloodless coup, overthrow her. And the coup was led by a group called the Committee of Safety. And essentially it was the city fathers of Honolulu. It was the business class of Honolulu. This is a satirical cartoon that portrays Queen Liliukalani in a very racist and very awful way. And then on this side it says gross immorality and scandalous government. And there she is dressed as if she's, well, who knows what she's dressed as, but it's very unflattering. And she's lifted on the bayonets of US Marines. So, just to give you a tenor of the challenges she was facing. In a woman in power, she's thrust into this position she never expected, and she's facing a very powerful group of adversaries. So this, believe it or not, is a story in the New York Times. And it describes the coup that overthrew Queen Liliukalani as the political crime of the century. Queen Liliukalani's dethronement, it was accomplished by the aid of US Marines, political crime of the century.
Wow.
So there was some acknowledgement that there's something very, very wrong that happened in 1893 to the Queen. And in fact, President Cleveland acknowledged this wrong and tried to change it to some extent, but was elected out of office or was voted out of office. And this is a photograph that a friend sent me. President Cleveland, I think, is buried in Princeton. And to this day, Hawaiians will bring flower garlands and put them over his gravestone to thank him for his support of the Queen. But I wanted to share that with you as well. So Queen Liliukalani's challenges, let me just also say that her challenges extended beyond being overthrown, because what then happened is shortly after she was imprisoned in the Liliukalani Palace under house arrest, and she was put on trial by a jury, and it was humiliating. It was a time of deep, deep soul searching, and this is where her Christian faith really comes in. So she was stuck in this palace. She had one companion who was a servant to her, a companion to her, and she spent that time tallying the hymns that she'd written over the years. And while she was there, she composed a hymn of forgiveness towards her enemies. And she modeled Christian behavior. She fought back as well as she could. After she was released, she went to Washington. She lobbied. She wrote a memoir that was really, it was called Hawaii's Story, but it was really a plea for the United States to reconsider the position of Hawaii. And she, in her peaceful way, tried to fight against this injustice. She failed at preventing Hawaii from becoming a territory of the United States. But she led her people in a lot of quiet ways. As I mentioned, she was a spiritual person, a deeply religious person. She acted her faith through her music every Sunday and at practices during the week. And she was beloved. She was beloved for her gentleness. So, and today, she left quite a legacy. She gave all of her money to create a trust, the Liliukalani Trust, which benefits Native Hawaiian women and children. And it's still very active today. It's a huge support for the community. And there are many ways that in Hawaiian culture she's remembered and revered. wisdom, for her faith, for her grace, for her ability to make beauty out of really the tragedy, so many tragic things that unfolded in her life.
Is that the queen?
That's the queen right there. That's a picture.
Oh, those are not the queens standing there. the
No,
person.
next to her, those are people who are involved with the trust, the Liliukalani Trust, and this is her picture. She died in, I think, now I'm forgetting, I think it was 1911, and she died in her own home, which was very close to the palace. It's now the governor's residence, official residence of the state of Hawaii. But it was really a privilege to get to know her story, and I tried to build out her story with her own letters to family members and people she was close to. And early on, somebody from the Hawaii State Archivist, the head archivist, said, "You've got to meet this guy." And it turned out that he'd been collecting letters for years and years that she had written. And no one had done that before. This man had, and he decided to share what he had done so far with me. And so I was able to tell a good part of her story in her own words and through her own letters. And her Christian faith comes through those letters as well. So if you're interested, the Queen Liliukalani Trust has finally published her letters. I think it's called the Queen's Diaries. And it's just come out this past year. It was edited, it was the work of the bibliographer David Forbes, who's my friend. And it's such a beautiful book. And the images are beautiful, and it's a lasting legacy to who she was. So anyways, I think I'll stop there, and I'd love to take questions if I may.
What does the trust usually go to, the Queen Liliukalani Trust? What does
so-
it usually go to?
It usually goes to supporting women and children, and I think like health initiatives, educational initiatives. There's a really good website. It'll tell you exactly the different nonprofits they support.
What's the website?
What's a website? So if you go, I would think it'd probably be, if you Google just Queen Liliukalani Trust, you'll find it. Yeah, and I can help you if you want me to.
Are there descendants of the Hawaiian royal family still in Hawaii?
Well, that's a great question. So, she never had children. She had Hanai children. She had adopted children. And a descendant of one of the adopted children is now the closest relative to her. And she is known as Abigail Kawana Koko. I'm going to get it wrong. I'm embarrassed. But I had the great privilege of meeting her in Honolulu shortly before the book came out, and she really appreciated the book. And she's still alive. She's quite elderly now. I believe she must be in her 90s. And she splits her time between California and Honolulu.
How long was the steamship ride way back in the day when the gentleman who was
Klaus Spreckles.
Yeah.
Well, typically a steamship ride right around the turn of the century, that's what I'm most familiar
Yeah.
with, would be about 6 days, 6 to 7 days between San Francisco and Honolulu. So that's a long trip. And often very rough. Not that, but imagine, after the roiling Pacific to finally get to Honolulu, and the steamers would approach, and you would hear the sounds of music, because almost always there's a band that accompanied any arriving steamships. The arrival times were always in the local newspapers because it was such a big deal, and often passengers would be greeted with flower lei. And I wish I could transport myself back to 19th century Hawaii. Herman Melville's got an amazing description, because he was on a whaling ship as a crew member. And he wrote about what 19th century Honolulu Harbor was like, and Honolulu itself was like. Yes?
I saw a documentary on her, and they mentioned that she committed suicide.
Oh, that's not true.
Oh,
No.
that didn't happen.
Oh, gosh, no, absolutely not. First of all, everything I know, that would have been completely against what she believed. in life, in her role as a leader of her people. No, she did not commit suicide. She died peacefully in her bed at a very old age.
Oh,
Yeah, and I would direct you, recently, a year or two ago, PBS American Masters did a short documentary on Queen Liliukalani, and it's absolutely delightful. It's about 14 minutes long. So again, you can kind of Google that, and it's really worth your time. It's beautifully illustrated with a lot of artwork.
It's a documentary.
It's a documentary about Queen Liliukalani.
What's the title of documentary?
Well, you would just go PBS American Masters, and then Liliukalani, and you'll find it immediately.
PBS American Masters?
Yes.
Could the information that was falsified in the documentary have been a part of a, like, narrative, a smear campaign that may have taken place when, she was in transition? Or, I mean, I'm just wondering how information like that, that's so incorrect, could have floated to the surface and gotten into a document.
Well, you're absolutely right. There was a smear campaign that was waged against her primarily by the mainland press. But by the time she died, Hawaii was a territory, she was quite elderly. I don't think there was an active campaign to, I just don't know. I don't know where that comes from. Yes?
How old was the king when he died?
Really good question. I'm fairly on the young side.
Yes.
Okay, let me think if I can figure this out.
Since it was so sudden, I was wondering if he was young.
Yeah, I'll have to get back to you. My guess is in his 50s, so very young. But I can answer your question more precisely if I.
And what's the story behind you writing the story?
Oh, that's always fun. Well, I grew up in the Bay Area, and I was always fascinated by the ties between California and Hawaii. We travel over the Carquinez Bridge, and on your right you see C&H, and that's of course the sugar company. If you go to Union Square and you see the column and you see the beautiful young figure of a young girl, well, that was Alma Spreckles before she became Big Alma Spreckles. When she was 16 years old, she modeled for that. So I started with the Spreckles family, but then I really came to realize the more interesting story was Queen Liliukalani and her challenges and how she faced them. And in general, I seem to be fascinated by this question of women in power, particularly in the 19th century when women's roles were changing so dramatically. And this is a woman who never expected to be in this role. I mean, she loved music, she loved the natural world, she loved her garden. And then all of a sudden she's contending with the quote committee of safety and geopolitics and having to go to Washington DC to testify. So it was a fascinating story to me. What do you do? And how did she find the courage and the resilience to make her way through a situation that seemed hopeless? Well, I think her Christian faith had a lot to do with it. Any other questions?
What was her education? You may have already talked about that, but she go to college or?
No, she was educated at the missionary school for chiefs' children. And let me think about this. She would have, I guess, completed what we would consider high school, but that's it. She never went to college.
Wow. Which part of Hawaii was Queen Liliukalani from?
Well, she was born in Honolulu, and she lived in Honolulu most of her life, but she traveled to all the islands many, many times.
Is that where her family's from too?
Yeah, that's where her family was
That's
from.
capital of Hawaii, right?
The capital of Hawaii, yeah, Honolulu. Yes?
Any background on her composition of Aloha Hawaii? Is it to a farewell to her beloved Hawaii, or?
Oh, that's so sweet you asked. Thank you for asking that question. It's believed to be just a plain old love song, and she saw two lovers who were saying goodbye, and she was very touched by that. So, we've come to see it as a very almost bittersweet song that reflects the conflicted nature of our mainland relationship with Hawaii. But in fact, it was a much smaller story that she was composing around. Well, thank you so much, everybody. Thank you, Reverend Joanne. Thank you, Sally.
Thank you all for being here.
Old age, I think, was heart failure. Really quite, she was quite old when she died.
So I'm not making promises, but Julia might be willing to sign some books. I've seen your books on your chairs and stuff. So if you've got your copy with you, she might be. Thank you.